So I'd like to welcome you to WhiteBox. And Lara Pan will explain and will introduce this lovely panelist. But I followed them all quietly through Google. Some I've seen the shows, and some I've seen what they write, and some I see what they show. Yep. And I'm totally touched because as we have here a genius, Fred Forrest, Leo is no less than that. He's a man from the Philippines who came to New York, like many of us, emigrants, to make this town super fabulous. But then at some point, after Park Place and all these things that this panel is going to be concentrating upon, and I'm crazy to learn more, because I come from an older time. I know everything about the 10th Street galleries, the Abex, etc. Those people I hung out with for 30 years, don't ask me why, because I used to be a punk, into music. I lived with Mission of Burma, I went to CBGB's Max Kansas City, yet I pay attention to painters. The fuck, it's like, excuse my French for Facebook, my God, my card was off. But anyhow, so anyhow, this is really part of what 20 years ago we began to do, to cover a territory that a lot of young people are a little bit averse to, or knowledgeable teachers are just not teaching much of anything of history. So everybody looks at magazines and some books out there on Google now and figure out in 5 minutes what anybody has been doing for a lifetime, right? So I have this weakness, and we began 20 years ago with Hermann Nietzsche, Günter Bruce, followed by Karol Schneemann, Dennis Oppenheim, Michael Snow, these guys who were on a bit of a low ebb of their great careers and influence, yeah? So I see Leo Valledor and with a strange neighbor, Fred Forrest, who Pierre Restany called him equal to Yves Klein, and such as a fabulous, strange marriage of coincidences, right? Both of them part of an art fair, right? Frieze, off-site in the city. So without more to say, I will pass the mic, lose my voice to Lara Pan, who put this succulent panel put together.
Thank you, Juan. It will be difficult after you to go with so many informations. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank you all you who came for this panel, because it was really done in such a short time frame. And also I would like to explain how this exhibition happened and why for me it's so important to I'm so happy that everybody accepted to be here and that we managed to put this exhibition and talk about Leo's work, because first time when I saw Leo Valledor's work was more than 10 years ago in San Francisco in a very small gallery, actually a small gallery, not with the size, but it was not known for me, and I was at the time living in Europe, which was a gallery of Julina Octogonon, who was representing the estate, and I was being invited for something else in San Francisco. It was my first time when I was there, and my eye catch this work of Leo Valledor, and it was the work, if I remember well, was the work from the 60s. It was the vector lines, it was unusual geometric shapes, which was really, for me, like I said, okay, this is something that I haven't seen before, and it really caught my attention, and it stayed in my head like for years, and I became a good friend with Julina, and I always wanted to do something with Leo's work. Also, the other reason why it was so interesting work, because it was so related to the music and sound, and what I said, the sound in his work, I think, is following even from the time of the Park Place group from the beginning of the career, as well as the geometry and the relation to color and space. So with this, I would like to also introduce, like, I think, the panelists that we are here, like first the gallery, thank you, David and Richard, thank you for helping us to put this project. And also I would like to ask Melissa, who did a great show last year, Melissa Rachleff, about to explain actually to all of us a little bit about Park Place Group, how the time was then, and about her perception about Leo's work, and also other participants of the Park Place, like Tamara. And please, would you like to?
You want me?
Yes.
Actually, I think that Tamara should really talk about Park Place. But before I weigh in, just because Tamara was there and started.
I know. So, but no, of course. But I was wanted if you do a little of introduction to the public who is maybe not familiar, and I would like then to invite Tamara to give her you were there and you work with Leo and you work with all the members, so to give another also point of view. Actually, it was for me more introduction to a group from your side and then Tamara's.
So maybe what I'll do is I'll imitate a conversation Tamara and I might have. So, so Tamara, I know that there was this building at 79 Park Place that I think Dean Fleming found, who is a painter. And can you tell me how you learned about it?
Let's see. A number of the people that came to be involved with Park Place arrived in New York within, I think, a 4 or 5 year period of time. And a number of people came 1962 in there. And Forrest Myers was one of the artists, and he and I had been in San Francisco. We were students. We got married and came to New York, my big dream. And Dean Fleming had found the space, 79 Park Place. And it was this crazy little building out in the middle of nowhere. Leo and Mary Valledor lived there. Dean Fleming lived there. And Frosty and I lived there. On the top floor, crazy little space, I have to say. The ceilings were very low, lots of windows all the way around, big, thick, white brick walls and windows all the way around the building. But it was great, and it was $35 a month. So we made this work. It was really primitive living, gotta say.
Yeah, and I remember the building itself wasn't a perfect rectangle. I remember you telling me it was more trapezoidal. Right.
Yeah.
So, and the way you divided the space with, where your studio was and where Frosty Myers' studio was on your floor. I think you were the second floor, right?
We were the second floor.
Right.
There was a Greek restaurant on the first floor. We had all the fumes coming up. And the fellow, there was probably a person lacking papers who was working in the restaurant during the day, but he didn't have anywhere to sleep at night. So there was no working elevator, so up the stairs we would go, and this fellow would be sleeping across the bottom of the stairs, and we would jump over him, and it really was like that. So, but it was very exciting.
And so you had a studio, and then on the third floor was Dean Fleming, a painter, and maybe Patsy Krebs was there, I think, at some point.
Some of that time, yeah.
Right, and then above Dean on the fourth floor was Leo and Mary.
Right.
And what was your work like then? Because you and Dean, I know, had a relationship, and you were also working with color, and I wonder if that had something to do with what you were studying in the Bay Area and some of the art teachers you had. there, and what you were how you were synthesizing that experience in New York.
Yeah, that was a big shift. The Bay Area, the thing that drew me to the Bay Area was Richard Diebenkorn. And that had to do with the way he used color and how he used space, which was very different from the Boston Museum School, where I had been before that. And then coming to New York was another big shift, because this is New York, and buildings and windows and rectilinear everything is a very different landscape and environment. And then Dean, I can't remember if he had been working with his grids right there in the beginning, or whether that developed later. He was, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the pencil drawings, and then his paintings come a little bit later that are also inspired by this idea of, 4D
Right.
Angles, and I mean, you can't really render 4D. I'm not an expert on 4D. Maybe you guys.
I'm not.
Okay. I did watch a high school PowerPoint. I watched several high school PowerPoints on 4D, thinking I can learn it that way, but I still have trouble anyway.
Yeah, well,
So how
was-
important was math to you? Yeah.
I had, as I was making my little notes to do this, that kind of 4D space, which was both in and out, I thought, you know what? If this was called interdimensional space, it would be more understandable. But I think that's what the 4D was trying to get at.
And I know Mark DeSuvero, who didn't live in the building, but he lived not far and knew all of you. He thought of it as space-time, which is even the name of his studio to this day, Space-Time. But that was that also a part of something that you were thinking of, space and time?
Personally, I was not.
Okay.
He's a sculptor.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's sort of, there's more space, there's real space and more time, I think.
And one of the things that I loved is that you began working with children's construction paper, different colored paper. Can you talk about that series?
Yeah, these were the pieces that were shown in this beautiful exhibition that you put together. It was a way to have ready-made color right away, just cutting it and putting it together, and I still do that. It's like something I do.
And also the idea of working with construction paper as a more modest material, was that?
Modest was a very important word in those days. I mean, there was no money, and you didn't need money, and nobody understands that right now.
But Tamara, how was the dynamics of you guys in Park Place? How was interactions between artists, exchange of the ideas, and because the work of everyone is quite different in a way. There was no repetition that you can see nowadays, the people repeating themselves. And I'm impressed of that time, because there was really, everybody has his own language, and they live together, which is difficult to keep nowadays, I think more difficult than in the past.
There was a lot of inspiration that went back and forth between one artist and another. And different ones were inspired by different things. Each person was really very different and had specifically different interests and inspirations. But the amazing part was how the work all seemed to come together. And between the color, between the shapes, I was trying to think about the word. there was an energetic about it that was unique. I think it was unique. I mean, that small show that you did had that about it too. As I walked around this was like 21 different galleries, and then there was Park Place.
Yeah.
And it seemed to just kind of...
It vibrates in this different way. Yeah.
And the work between the painting and the sculpture, and sometimes all the exhibitions that we did in the larger space would have a painter and a sculptor. And so there were all these vistas between the sculpture, looking at the painting, and they all worked together. I don't know how to even describe that, but many different personalities came together and resonated. Not intentionally.
Right.
It wasn't a plan. Like, what do we do to try to all... No, it happened in a very organic and natural way.
Mm-hmm. But many of you actually, not all of you, I mean, Ed Ruda, Mark de Souvero, Robert Grosvenor, who are also part of it, they didn't study at the California College of Arts and Crafts, which is now the San Francisco Art Institute. But you did, Leo Valledor did, Frosty Myers did, Dean Fleming, and Peter Farakis. So that's 5
out of 9
coming out of the
original
same
9,
school, which is, I think that still happens. But I think that's also a kind of shared experience and maybe a kind of shared knowledge, perhaps. I don't know if that also communicated.
I think in a subtle way, it had something to do with it. Mm-hmm. And Mark de Souvero had spent a lot of time on the West Coast, not at the California School of
Berkeley,
Arts, but
yeah. And then could you just talk a bit? So 79 Park Place. That was about a year or so of exhibits, and then
2 years before moving to West Broadway.
West Broadway, right? Can you talk about that move to West Broadway and how it changed? Because I think that's the more mature.
The 79 Park Place was going to be torn down for the Twin Towers, and that was a sad day because this $35 a month rent was going to go. And then we needed to go forward. By then, a lot of people had paid attention to Park Place. I mean, collectors would troop up the stairs and come see it. And then we also had group shows that included a lot of other artists. And that was an important part of what we were doing. We were including a lot of other people, performers and musicians and others. So it did have to go on. And the main people conceiving how it was going to go were Frosty, Dean, and Mark de Souvero. And their concept, I mean, nobody has done this since, to my knowledge, was putting together 5 collectors and making a commitment of 1 piece per collector, per artist, per year for 2 years. So that was the agreement. And these are major collectors.
Vera List,
Patrick
Lannon, Guiberson,
and Murkison from Texas, and Virginia Dwan. Is that everybody?
That might be. Oops, there's one missing.
Because the Guiberson and the Murkisons were together. They were a unit. Who are we missing?
I can't remember. I should have reviewed that more. That might miss there. But Linda Henderson's book on Park Place has them all. But that was so in exchange for their annual contribution.
Say Vera List?
Yeah, Vera List.
We said that.
We did.
Oh. Okay, I don't remember.
But that one artist would give an artwork.
Yeah.
Every artist would give an artwork. And the Paula Cooper papers, because Paula Cooper came to work, you hired Paula Cooper I think, I can't remember, 65 or 66. And she would correspond with them about their contribution, lack of contribution, late contribution. You know, you said you were going to give the money. Where's the money?
She was amazing.
Yes, right. They're great. And then different things going wrong with the sculptures when they would arrive. You know, the collector's writing. You know, this. You know, we tried to install it. This doesn't work. You know that. So it's a lot. So there was a lot. So on the one hand, it was a great model of having philanthropists pay. On the other hand, you know, they were persnickety, and you know, like you had to really make sure, like they took it very seriously. So you know, you really had to tend to it. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't just no labor involved.
Well, didn't some artists get a bit frustrated by that system, feeling that they were sort of overburdened, having to deliver 5 works every year,
Yeah.
Right.
large works, etc.
And yet, what an amazing opportunity at this
Right.
time.
Not
So,
many people at that time had that model. I mean, it was so like smartly
think
done.
anyone has had
no,
that model
and I
since.
know when I talked to Carol Schneeman, I mean, how they struggled and how like I mean, I think Klaus Oldenburg has his studio there that he was doing okay, and Rauschenberg is doing pretty well, but he was the only one, I think. And maybe you guys like with this model like was.
Well, it was
something
also a
just-
model to get away from sales. I think
yes,
that
it's a great model.
I think that Marc de Suvero felt that very keenly because of, you know, there was the height of his career when he decided that the values of 57th Street weren't, you know, really weren't his values in terms of just commerce, art as commerce. So I think that he was a big instigator.
Absolutely, and his original idea was when we had 79 Park Place is that whenever there would be a sale, we would divvy it up between the artists. That was Marc's concept.
Right.
And he was the only one selling any art. But the other guys were saying, oh, no, that's not, oh, no. What?
Right,
Oh, well.
right.
But he had a very altruistic perspective all the way through,
And still does.
and still does. Yes.
In fact, I don't know if your travels have taken you ever to his studio, but his studio is, you know, he is everyone related to somebody who is involved with Park Place. You know? So it's, you know, Dean Fleming's son does work there. So, you know, so he really, he's very, and he started Socrates Sculpture Park, which is such a gift to our city. So, but it all really starts, you know, with you guys, this idea of giving back.
But I would like to ask David, as a gallerist working with the estate of Leo, how you get first time in contact with Leo's work. Can you tell us? I mean, when was the first time, and what was your reaction?
Well, I was aware of his work for some time. Can you hear us if we talk? Okay. I usually don't have a problem projecting. But anyway, so yeah, I was aware of Leo's work because we have, our gallery tends to represent people who are clustered around you know, themes and groups like Park Place and other, you know, major sort of institutions like that. So we always tend to have this connectivity between people in our gallery. And so I was aware of Leo's work and very smitten with it because it was just distinctly different, you know, which is what I really liked about it. And then we were actually approached by the estate to start, you know, representing him through Julina. So that's how we got involved a number of years ago. And then his work, you know, we've had solo shows. We curated his work in a lot of different group shows. Again, you know, just trying to provide context for people in terms of how it relates to so many other sort of, you know, formalist concerns at the time he was producing it, and also just his peers and his friends. So, and that's the nice thing about the Park Place group. And here in New York, I mean, there's so many people. If you're working with anyone over the age of 65 or 70, almost all of them had something cooking at some point with Park Place. They were either a friend, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, maybe with several of them over time. And so it was just kind of an interesting group. There was a lot of inner dynamics. And so it was just, it's very fun to work with them because you keep sort of always learning so much more about other artists within the group and other artists here in New York who were friends and colleagues. So it was very dynamic.
Alex, you wrote just a catalog about Ted Stam, and I saw like his Wooster series was from '74, and it was also, he was being very active in the '60s. So do you know, is there any relation with the Park Place group of Ted Stam, or in correlation with the Leo? Did they met, do you know, or did they know each other, or?
I don't think they would have known each other because Ted Stam didn't move to New York until '68, which is after
Yes.
Park Place had closed and Leo had gone back to San Francisco. I'm sure he was aware of Park Place and
Yes.
admired that, because I think you're sort of implying this sort of radical shaped canvas
Exactly.
that Stam was working with is definitely related, I think, to these sort of, eccentrically shaped models that were really, in a way, the innovation of the Park Place artists.
I don't know, I was wondering if they were aware of each other or if each other work. What I think that it's possibly that they were, but that's...
They may have been aware, yes, but I don't know if they ever met.
You know, one question I never, do you mind if I ask you, Alex?
Please.
Frank Stella, I really think of them more separately, but he's also doing the shaped canvases, following the line, really different kind of work. His color, certainly when you look at it with Leo's, like there's something very different going on with the color. And,
Sure.
But do you know if there's any, in your research on Stella, did anything come up in looking at the work of the Park Place artists? He would have been older than them, so I'm not sure,
Well, he was quite young. I mean, I think maybe he was a few years younger. He was successful quick, which is, something interesting about Stella. But, his version of the shaped canvas comes very early, and I think obviously is sort of very different. I see, the shaped canvas almost is an endless onion in itself because there's so many different models that come out. And, I'm very interested, for example, how Valledor's work seems to be engaged with these questions of speed and movement, and that sort of gives life to the sort of shapes that he's using in the 60s, whereas, for example, Stella is choosing shape almost for the opposite purpose. He's choosing as you mentioned, a shape that sort of follows the line, that is sort of referential to the patterns that he has instituted within, the canvas, and it creates this sort of unity. And this sort of stasis and this sort of emphasis of the object-likeness of the canvas. So again, another artist, probably even more so, who would have been aware of the Park Place group. Potentially he must have seen shows, and I don't know if Tamara, you were ever met Stella in that context of Park Place.
He was definitely around and about and in and out and at similar parties and galleries and events.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I don't think he ever showed any of his work at Park Place.
I don't know.
But
Some of the shapes, though, that Alex is talking about, though, for example, the ones that are up there right now are classics from Park Place. And they're parallelograms, and they're not shaped as the ones that are downstairs, which are curvilinear and rectilinear forms. Then there was also, this was sort of a classic shape from the Park Place, which was much more eccentric and, to me, more evocative of Ted Stam's. Mm-hmm. So, Ted's is sort of centered around, what is it, like a structure that was in the street or something, or not a cul-de-sac, but some sort of a little island. But these sort of pieces of Leo's, this is very reminiscent of what was happening there in Park Place. And I just put these slides together because none of these 60s paintings are in the show downstairs. The show downstairs is curatorially very specific around the 80s work and single canvases and mid-size work. Leo's works were quite huge. Well, they range, up to 8-10 feet long, and some of them just 4 or 5 feet long. So they were quite diverse in size. But these were kind of the two type of motifs. And then when Alex brought up the 1968, when there was sort of the dissolution of Park Place, then Leo moved back to San Francisco. And this was a series he first did when he went back to San Francisco, two of the types, and it was called East-West series. It was from 68 to 71. So I just want to let people sort of see kind of visually what was happening in terms of Leo's work. So when he went to San Francisco, it became even more reductive and minimal, and had kind of moved away from the vector geometry and the vector planes that had, or lines that Lara had commented on earlier. So just want to get you kind of up to speed visually of what was happening. So just as a backdrop, since none were downstairs, sorry.
But I'm curious also about the process, the creative process, because Soloit use sound, and he use for certain works he use musical scores, and we know how much music was important, the sound to Leo's work. So for me it looks, it's a question I would like to have everyone's opinion on it. It's that this almost invisible sound is also present at the time of the Park Place, as a research of a specific space, if I can say that, in this even vector works. So I would like to hear your opinion, because this is for me ongoing through all his career, this presence of the sound. Mm-hmm. So if you have any comment on that.
Well, that goes back to Tamara, I think what she was asking about earlier. So for example, did you, since Mary and Leo lived in the building, did you guys ever have discussions, technical or critical discussions around work, or brainstorming on sort of what you were going to do next, or problems, or?
There was a lot of discussion in general about what was art and what was not art. My memory, anyways. There was more of that type of discussion than the ins and outs of why this happened or why I'm interested in this. Leo was really interested in color and the vibrational resonance expression of that. And for him it was related to music. I'm not a musician, but the color in his work, particularly at that time, so incredibly, the way the 2 colors or 3 colors would work together was incredibly beautiful and elegant and, beautiful. This was not a word. Nobody liked to say this beauty word in those days.
Well, I thought beautiful was okay, but pretty was really bad.
Oh, pretty was very bad. Beautiful wasn't so. But they were beautiful. And it was interesting for me because Leo, personally, he was the person that I knew maybe the least of everyone. But I related to his sense of using color the most. So that was just interesting.
Why would
he was a more private person, maybe.
That's what I was going to ask. What was it?
Yeah.
He sort of kept to himself. Or?
Yeah.
I brought something that has some quotes from Leo. Do you want me to?
Sure.
Should I do my thing? I didn't know what I was doing, so I did. I brought a thing, so I'd be coherent. So I'll just do it, but I want you all to dive in and fill in the blanks. But so it all comes out of seeing the show downstairs and things I've been thinking about since I saw the show, and David gave me a wonderful tour. So I call it Extending the Empirical, a very rough sketch. Leo Valledor was born in 1936 in San Francisco. His parents had emigrated from the Philippines to California 2 years after the U.S. passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act, which set strict immigration quotas, and for the Philippines, that meant only 50 people per year. That act, coupled with the anti-miscegenation laws and similar discriminatory immigration acts, most famously the Chinese Exclusion Act, controlled the Asian population in the United States. Asian women were frequently barred from immigrating to the US, and this meant there was a sizable bachelor population. In 1943, Filipinos were extended US citizenship if they joined the armed forces, for World War II. However, it was not until the passage of the civil rights laws during the Johnson administration, including the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, which removed the quotas based on national origin some 40 years later, and that allowed families to reunite once again. So Leo Valledor had a cousin, the artist Carlos Villa, and he described the oppression they experienced growing up in San Francisco among all communities of color in San Francisco. He called it a ghetto within another ghetto within a metropolis. It was a Filipino ghetto side by side with a Japanese ghetto in the middle of a black ghetto, which was at Fillmore and in the middle of San Francisco. The neighborhoods that were unwelcoming to non-white residents of the cities, areas like North Beach, Richmond, and the Mission District before and during World War II, those areas were white only, and that extended to people who weren't Christian. Jews and Muslim, especially the Armenian population, weren't allowed to live in those neighborhoods either. And I should say the same thing's going on in New York. It's not just to pick on San Francisco. But I share this context because the exhibit organized by the David Richard Gallery is called Color as Space. And I want us to think about both something socially constructed and controlled. So there's Leo's color, but then there's also color, the way in which we're kind of categorized and grouped in terms of these ideas constructed around race. There are more to these paintings than just the empirical. They are masterful in their opticality and their color harmonies, but color and space can be extended into the social because race and representation was very much in the forefront of art making during the 1980s when these paintings were made. Leo always talked about freedom, Carlos Villa remembered. And I knew when he talked about freedom, it was going beyond the ghetto. Keen observers of Valledor's work aligned his approach with music, specifically the jazz of the 1950s and 1960s, a period known as free jazz, which grew from improvisation and a search for harmonies that were not prescribed or predetermined. Carlos Villa identified jazz as the very ultimate expression of communities of color. Valledor's approach to color was in line with free jazz because he said, "An idea I have about complementary color and the rest is intuitive. I mix the colors the way I want to see it, but it has something to do with the complementary color of warm color versus a cool color because it's the only way you can create this kind of vibration which I see between colors. It's like placing two certain notes of sound together and you get a tone." One of the greatest innovators of free jazz, Ornette Coleman, was invited to be the music director at Park Place, the gallery that Valledor helped to found. Carlos Villa, who was part of the discussion with Coleman, remembers that the conversation veered into their training in college. Coleman said that when he was in music school, they taught him all they knew, but they didn't teach him what he knew. And maybe that is why Valledor's insistence that his work was not about geometry, not about mathematics, is so important. Valledor said, "It uses geometric elements, but I don't see it as geometric art. I don't see it in terms of mathematics, in terms of anything else but a vital thing. I've never thought of math as influencing my ideas or any concepts of visual space." The search for knowledge gets complicated when one's experiences are outside a discourse, when one's subjectivity forms a resistance to categorizations that, on the surface, seem obvious. The literature on Valledor is shaped by the way in which American dominant culture saw him, not by what he saw. to borrow from Ornette Coleman. I think this is the challenge with Valledor's work, how to get beyond the empirical into the subjective aspects of what he made. And getting into the subjective brings Valledor's values, his lived experiences, into the discussion. The 1980s were about making different values valid within the mainstream. Synthesizing Valledor's cultural heritage into optical abstraction is a project that needs to happen. So I'll end my sketch with this. If you have a smartphone, Google the term Philippine flag, and you will see the 1898 design. And I don't know if we got Google here, but we can do that. It was made during the rise of the Filipino independence movement at the start of the Spanish-American War, when the country became an American-controlled territory. The red and blue vectors that end in 45-degree angles to form a white triangle. The contrasting colors, the horizontal turned into a triangle, and the aspect ratio of the triangle to the vectors as 1:2 might be a place to work on a new conversation about Leo Valledor and his remarkable paintings.
Isn't that, Rio, the AIR, A-I-R, that series? It looks like the Filipino flag, yeah. He did sort of variations on that. Oh, yeah.
Just got me thinking.
I don't know how to get out of this and then get back in it, so I'm technically... we
Anyway,
just
we all
have to
have
stay sitting with this picture behind us for a while.
Well, but the flag,
Yeah.
but the flag, I don't know, do you have internet on that? Show it to people so you can see.
Oh, sorry. Here it is.
So you guys can see that there's a conversation. I mean, I don't want to be so reductive that everything, but I think that and I should also say that Carlos Leo Valledor died in 1989. Yes. And his cousin, Carlos Villa, was one of the first people in San Francisco to start a Philippine art history concentration where he was teaching. And then he hooked up with Asian American artists, really kind of getting Asian American art, into the conversation in a different way during the late 80s and early 1990s. So it's we're still working on this, but
Feet by 6 feet. I mean, it's just the scale is just so interesting, and he was bouncing between these things, between these sort of musical notes downstairs that were those sort of more circular and curvilinear ones are from a series that was or an exhibition was called Jazz, and they look like notes, and that's why we sort of hung them so they sort of looked like they were sort of bouncing like a note.
But sorry to interrupt you. I mean, it's just I was thinking what Melissa said and about this. His thinking and about the freedom and the constant sound and influence of jazz and me and David and you, I said there is, and I agree there is no influence of like mathematics and geometry, but he knew it so well. So we were laughing with this. Oh my God, he was such a big master of actually shape and geometry, but was not that influence really the work and the research towards the color. So
I think it was the means to an end, to be honest. I don't think it was his focus like a lot of artists at that time who were, geometric artists like Carl Benjamin and some of these other guys, but I think it was more of a means to an end. And the main thing I think with Leo, like this is a good example. These are the ones that are downstairs. Is this contrast of really sharp lines with curved lines, and these rocking colors, and then something that looks very flat and matte. And it's those constant contrasts. It's always creating this internal tension within the work, and lobbing off a part of a circle or squaring a circle, squaring a part of a circle. I mean, all these things are like not normal, and so, but what they do is they sort of excite or energize your eye along with these sort of other contrasts between color, these really strong vector shapes, and this contrast between squares and circles. And they're always kind of operating in his work. And so I think it's what kind of gives them this, like these, it's like buoyancy and vibrancy. And the other ones are like portals, like this other one. Like that clearly looks like a passageway opening, you know? And again, the one panel going in and the other one coming out, the blue. And he did that very subtly. Those two, the large panel is blue with a dark green on the left edge, and this other is like just a shade with more red in it, like a lavender blue. And so she's real subtle sort of things, but it creates these sort of tensions. But it's that shape, just that subtle cutting off the top panel, you know, there at the top, that really makes you realize, oh, that's like a portal, it's like a doorway, it's a passageway, you know. And I think that's what's really interesting about his work. It's just this simplicity and elegance about it. And I think to me, he's fairly unique. I mean, there's nothing like this work. There's really nobody else has really sort of replicated this or been doing it, which is why I think it still seems so fresh.
I don't think any artist wants to do somebody else's work.
Oh, no, but you can't hardly avoid it. You know, a lot of times, you know, when you talk about shaped canvases, you know, there's a scat of other names that nobody brought up, like Ted Williams and, you know, Chuck Hinman and, you know, Ellsworth Kelly and, you know, just on and on and on. So there were a lot of people playing with shapes and canvases, and some were concerned with them for different reasons. The exterior of the canvas versus the interior, you know, and curves versus squares. I mean, you know,
But
picture
I guess
plane
like
versus
thinking
not.
about the 1980s, so like in the 1980s, it's you know, as you say, you know, Ellsworth Kelly, a lot of people have already made that, you know, their subject. So it's like, when we think of the 80s, and we think of painting in the 80s, it's painting's kind of, you know, just if we want to do it writ large, painting's a bit under attack, you know. There's the beginning of performance and installation. You know, on the other hand, you have like these, like the expressionists like Schnabel and Solly and others, another generation, and then Leo's continuing his pursuit of color and form, but it is this other moment, and he's back in the Bay Area for a while now. He's more in the Bay Area than in New York at this point in his life. Like New York was just this, 10-year or decade episode. And so as a historian, I suppose, I really want to try to locate it more in its moment around what was maybe going on, which I didn't have time to research, but like what else is going on in the Bay Area, why is opticality, still, a focus, and how what is he doing and how is he thinking, about, his studio practice at that juncture. And that's, I think, a question that needs to be researched. These are, don't you think so?
No, absolutely. I mean, I also think that, something else that's always interesting is, art historians often privilege those sort of primary moments at which artists have their discoveries, or these sort of condensed, episodes in which everything seems to coalesce. And so that's why you have it's Malevich, it's the Black Square. It's not like the late conflicted work around
people.
Exactly, so art history often likes these, these sort of moments, and they seem to feed into, a sort of chain of development. And often I find that art historians, and me being one of them, it's hard to sometimes account for, if one takes that idea of progression, it's hard to account for quote unquote later work. Because, I think part of what you're suggesting is, well, what do we make of, is this just an artist who, and I actually don't have an answer, of course, to this, but is this an artist who, in the 50s and 60s comes to a vocabulary and then develops that vocabulary, and is it thus internal to the work? I think that obviously happens with some artists. Frank Stella is an example of an artist, I think, that develops internally rather than, is always in relationship to the world around. But I think you, at the same time, have suggested the possibility that Valledor is actually not an artist who was only developing internally, that, maybe there was something else, that was pushing the development of his examination of form and color rather than just a formal apparatus.
You know, Carlos Villa said that growing up in San Francisco, you need to learn how to read the codes, you know, the codes among other, you know, the extended Filipino family of a lot of uncles, but also the codes around the black community that they were living in, and the kind of games that people would play in terms of insults, and you know, and like what the rules were, and how to be hip to those rules, but then also going to these magnet high schools. They both went to these, you know, academic high schools with a large white population, a Jewish population, and there's a different social code. And so I think that you know, and Carlos Villa, you know, is really, you know, very articulate, you know, about this kind of navigation of identities, right? And I think, you know, and he's always invoking his cousin Leo as someone who understands all of this. And that's what I mean. It's like we want, I think that we're so attracted to the work and we really just want to talk about it, you know, in this kind of objective, empirical way. But I think that we miss something deeper, and I don't have the answer, but I think that like there's such a rich, fertile area to study and to try to synthesize that, to not take away from the opticality at all, but to deepen what's going on with color and why the colors he's picking.
Well, I've had a lot of ideas about this over the years because I've been very drawn to abstraction, obviously, as a sort of subject, a lot of the artists that I engage with as an art historian, but I've also been very, you know, curious about these sort of artists from, you know, minority backgrounds who work in that mode, and what is it, and again, I don't have an answer, because of course there is no one answer, of, you know, what is it that attracts some artists, and you have someone like, say, Joe Bayer, who discusses how, you know, people thought she was a man to paint this work, and, you know, that she was aping a male form, you know, and a lot of artists like her or Agnes Martin sort of wanted to, you know, play into this idea that, you know, it's not about gender, that anyone can make this kind of work. And I feel like we see a resurgence of this now, even as many artists, you know, sort of minority artists are being reconsidered and given, you know, attention. There's often this discourse, like an artist like, say, Carmen Herrera, often the discourse is saying, oh, well, she's as good as Ellsworth Kelly, she should have been in that discourse. And in a way, yes, that's true, but also it sort of erases a bigger question, which is exactly, well, what is it about her work that is different, that is not Ellsworth Kelly? Mm-hmm. And of course, Ellsworth Kelly is also, a gay man, so that's its own set of questions. But anyway, I was thinking also about what you were saying in terms of, how does, say racial or gender difference affect a relationship to, say, abstraction. And I think what you're saying about codes is actually, related to this, because you could say that abstraction is one code, it's a sort of, in some ways, a dominant code established by, heterosexual white, Western European men. But on the other hand, it offered a freedom. And I find this very interesting. For example, I love this essay that the queer filmmaker Jack Smith wrote about his good friend Walter de Maria. And I was really fascinated because he talks about these very minimal works of de Maria, who was a heterosexual white male artist, and yet for him, they created this space precisely of freedom. So that when he was sort of encountering these very minimal reduced objects, they actually created a liberation because he was not confronting questions of identity. And so even though we often think of identity as wanting to be recognized and affirmed, that there are also these other ways of engaging, which I think often it's maybe not the dominant mode by which we understand, this political apparatus moving, but yet there are a very interesting group of artists, and again, not all of them, and I don't think Valledor was himself maybe politically, thinking of his work as political, and yet the politics maybe reside in this act of doing, say, abstraction, but doing it differently. So the relations, the rhythms, again, they're formal, they're not explicitly political, they're not maybe, in many cases tied to, say, a Filipino background, and yet to see something like color relationships, tonality differently. You know, I mean, this is the same idea, I guess, of jazz in relationship to other forms of music and so on.
Right, and that idea like Ornette Coleman had, it's like going to the finest conservatories and learning something, but not ultimately feeling like there's a conversation, there's a subjectivity that he has that the teachers don't understand, like that he has to, and that can't be articulated or can't be recognized, and it's not part of the discourse. So he goes on and he just like reinvents music. Do you know what I mean? And so like for Leo, Valledor, hearing that music, you know, because like most artists started out working representationally, you know, that's how he got to art school. But hearing that music, you know, made him want to try to represent that music through color, right? But it's not, you know, it wasn't the Beatles, you know, it was Ornette Coleman, you know, and anyway, so I'm thinking there's a significance to what he's listening to, what he's relating to, and the kind of tonalities that he wants to bring to us. There's that even though these paintings seem universal, you know, that we can understand them, they're also, like anyone's work, they're totally subjective, and to understand more about the person, which I grew up in a generation where that was like this kind of an intellectual dead end, don't do that. But now I realize that actually that isn't, you know, and that you kind of need, you need those subjectivities if you want to try to rethink categories and rethink values to make them more open and expansive. So.
I think though with the period that seems always to me a little bit different with Valledor's work is 68 to 71. And to me, it's almost like that was his period of introspection. And he went back to San Francisco and he did these, and they weren't somber, but because some were silver and platinum and sort of grayish, but they weren't, I never saw them as dark or somber. I see them as sort of, they're very introspective and sort of like a period of soul searching or something. And then he came out of that, you know, with these, you know, pieces in the 70s and through the 80s that, to me, his work always seems very positive. It always seems very upbeat. The only period that wasn't was the 68 to 71, and even then it wasn't like a downer. It just was very introspective. And like he was like really thinking very intensely about what he was doing in the next move. But I do see music in even those, you know, I mean, the circular form is like classic in terms of, you know, undefined space. It doesn't have a border and a boundary, and you know, so it's that's where he wasn't limiting himself. But then those pairs of paintings were very interesting. They almost look like sheet music, you know. They look like 2 pages of music. And so everything seems to tie back in a way to music, because I think even those ones from the 60s, you know, like these, they look like sheet music, you know, in a way, or like piano keys, or, you know, they have a rhythm and a beat about them. And I think that's the one thing with all of his work, even in the 80s, there's this mixing of forms and everything, and he does put them together in a way where there is sort of a rhythm or a pattern or beat about them. So I do think everything ties back to music, but I think the ones in the 80s are so rocking in terms of color, and that was such a dreary time in art, you know, I mean, between the whole thing with the NEA and the sort of, you know, really shutting down things, shifting in the feminist movement. But his work was always very bright.
The Reagan era.
The Reagan era, yeah. And so Jesse Helms, and so, but none of the works in the 80s reflect that at all. You know, there's nothing abject about them. There's nothing, you know, protest about them. So they're kind of a revelry or something. It's just sort of interesting when you look at his work and you think about it in a broader context of the whole 4 decades. Even what he did during the abstract expressionist period, those paintings were all circular and sort of swirling.
But also, like, I'm thinking about those works. When you work today, like for example, with the composers or sound artists, and they want to produce the work which they're gonna express what they see and what they hear. It's kind of having this type of shapes as a code, And then I think there was this, what Melissa mentioned, there is this permanent, I think, research of the fourth dimension through color and sound as a part of freedom, as maybe an escape, like of an artist actually, and of a painter. That painter who is like seeing the music and the sound and the color and has a unique signature of it.
Well, I think it's work that throughout, one thing that seems a continuity is that it's sort of projecting something else for you to experience. It's not, except maybe this more, dare I say, more minimal moment in the late 60s, where it seems more about the object and this sort of groundedness, and he takes out color, or at least the sort of strident color that you were mentioning. And so I'm just very curious that sort of in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there is that interest in having the work take you somewhere else. And so again, I don't know if that was in his mind, but I feel like there is this potential aspect where the work was meant to be outside of, the dreariness of the everyday, the banality, but also the conflict, and maybe the work, and again, I think that's why a lot of artists, you think again of the utopian moment of like the teens and 20s, where artists, like Malevich, saw again abstraction as a way to envision something better, something outside of, the present. Sort of a utopian element.
Well, they read. Did you read at California College? Did you read the Kandinsky on the spiritual in art? Did you have to read? Yeah.
It wasn't required, but yeah.
That was very much in the air. Maybe there was a new translation. I'm not sure why, but that was in the air. The Kandinsky's writing on the spiritual in art, and I think that that definitely. Also is, because that's the other thing. People, I think, got really mad when they would read about Malevich, and then he would have all these crackpot ideas that didn't seem to go along with what we were seeing. It's like, what? That's what you think this is about. So. Well,
and I think that the early '60s was an important moment for the sort of resuscitation of that avant-garde moment of Russian art. Sort of broadly, you had the publication of Malevich's crazy writings.
Yes.
In English, you also had
I
Camilla
shouldn't say
Gray's,
crazy.
Or it is.
Make up your own mind.
Okay, that was harsh.
It is what it is. But
Make up your own mind.
I've also heard the translation is maybe a bit dodgy.
So,
but
yes,
anyway,
that's the thing.
Camilla Gray's important book,
Yes.
which I imagine was important to people at Park Place as it was for people like Saul LeWitt and Smithson. The book on Constructivism.
One of the first books ever in English on Constructivism. I don't know.
I didn't read it.
That wasn't, yeah.
But I don't know.
But I wanted to say also that, that 1964, 5 in there, anyone who's old enough, there was a huge expansion of consciousness going on at that time. And
Baba Ram Dass.
not only many people. It was like coming out of the dark ages of the 50s. And so there was something about that. Is that spiritual? Maybe. But that was present for many, many people. And was it directly, or was it more part of the work, I would say? Yeah. But that was part of what was going on at that time. As a big burst. It was palpable.
When would you say that sort of consciousness altering aspect of geometry and color was perhaps maybe more important to an artist like yourself or the other artists at Park Place than, say, the idea of mathematics or, was that a part of the attraction?
It was.
Yeah.
I would say yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think the artist into math was Donald Judd.
Right. My sense is that the Park Place artists got tagged this way, and there was that element, and people like Dean Fleming were sort of conversant in those ideas, but I feel like they definitely saw them. My sense is you all saw them in this much more sort of consciousness expanding way, like, okay, these theories are there, but they apply to that. You know, they're not just, it's not Max Bill, it's not, you know, De Stijl, it's something else.
Do you know what I think sometimes the minimal group, you know, I got to meet Brian O'Doherty, and he did this experimental magazine that kind of brought together ideas that were foundational for the minimalists. And it seemed to me, and Saul LeWitt was in that, Mel Bachner, I'm not remembering who else, but and
Dan Graham.
Dan Graham, right. One of the things in my conversation with him that I said, it seemed that at that moment there was this desire, and it goes to the Duchamp article on the kind of I forgot some art act, or you know
the creative act.
The creative act, right? Where Duchamp towards the end says that you know that there's this art exists in the artist's head, and then they make the object or make the painting.
When this was a record, I think.
Yes,
in
exactly.
that issue of Aspen.
Right.
Magazine.
He had Duchamp read it out loud, and he made a record of it. But there's what he calls this art coefficient that is, the thing that's in your head is not identical to the thing that's made, and then it's ultimately not in your control. It's the viewer, who has all the interpretive control over it, and he has that great sentence: the artist can shout from the rooftops, "I'm a genius," but it's the viewer who will decide. But when in talking with Brian, I realized that it seemed to me that you were interested, you and your group, with Bachner and LeWitt, you were interested in coming up with an art form that could exist in the head as it exists in form. Like there isn't this break. And the thing with the Park Place artists is that, and even though it seems so precise, with what Leo's doing, I think that it isn't. It's not LeWitt. It's not like I could ideate it and then it could actually be made as it exists in my brain. But that it is an idea. I'm going to work it out on canvas, and there's going to be all these changes. All these changes are going to start happening from what was in my head, and it comes through the act of making. And that they were really committed to a studio practice and act of making. And I think that that's really a kind of conceptual difference with maybe those other artists.
I agree with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also I think one of the things that Park Place did not have, there was no spokesman for what we were doing. There was no articulate person like the minimalists had that, and other people had someone to speak and say, this is what's going on here. Which may have something to do with the fact that it couldn't continue. Because it was kind of like a rocket that exploded and had all kinds of influence and impact and so on, but it didn't have the words to continue.
Well, I was going to ask you.
I'm making that up, but I think that's the key of why it couldn't. Right.
Well, I think this is even in the most famous article about Park Place, which this sort of E=mc², David Bourdon essay, which I find amazing because even as he's sort of trying to make it this cohesive stuff, he's saying, well, but Dean Fleming thinks this and Leo Valledor thinks that, and he sort of has to admit that as much as he wants to pull it under the the realm of say the mathematical and these new ideas about space and time, that even amongst those ideas, even if two artists in Park Place shared an interest in those ideas, the way they interpreted them and made them into art was radically different. So you could see already it wasn't coalescing in a way.
Right.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're describing like Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young fighting in the back of the film war.
Wait, they didn't get along? Yeah, I think that there's, I mean, Donald Judd was writing art criticism, Robert Morris was, kind of carving out territory for sculpture, for his sculpture, and a different attitude towards sculpture. And Brian O'Doherty, writing under different pseudonyms, was also
Clement Greenberg was writing right in that time too.
and hostile to all of it. Yes.
Influence.
Well, and in that you see the power of writing, because even though all those artists were saying, oh, well, I'm just writing to explain myself and it's in the work, nonetheless, the sort of longevity and success that minimalism, conceptual art, even, color field painting, even if it may not be so much in favor, nonetheless has a role in art history because of these people like Greenberg, these champions that were able to write very articulately and in depth and regularly about the work. And something like Park Place, I think a very basic reason of why it's not in the history books as much as maybe it should be is because even though it was so influential on a sort of grassroots level of people attending, participating, sort of seeing art in that context, there wasn't the writing. And again, someone like David Bourdon trying to, it didn't fit into words, and that doesn't help art history, unfortunately.
Was in existence either. So.
But also I have a question, like you pointed really well, because I mean, when I saw the work was in 2006, and then from there is maybe 3 shows, one that you did, Linda, and I don't know, maybe 3 or 4. There is not many exhibitions, and we met 2 weeks ago. But I'm talking about not being from Europe and seeing this is for me. I'm very surprised. How is this possible? Something like that should be all over the place.
There's a lot that should have been. But I also should say that women. I mean, Mary. I'm sorry, Tamara. Your own career. You are an artist, utterly equal to all the artists that you were around. But your career and even the way you're represented in the group. Sort of the girl, and
the girl,
that it's constructed in a certain way in that era that that was very normal. It's easy for us to look back and say, oh, that was so sexist, but it was just normal. It was just the way the way people interacted, and yet it had an impact on your career.
Definitely, yeah. It's taken me a long time to kind of even see that with any clarity, because I just wanted to make paintings. But there was a lot of undercurrent that existed.
There's this one picture, I should have brought it. You're in the center. I think Frosty's kind of near you, and then there's a gap. And Leo's way off, he's oh, I don't know, I want to be in this picture. He's way off, and then there's all these other guys, and they're guys,
And Mark refused to be in that picture.
Yeah, Mark wasn't in it.
It's no, I'm not. I'm not doing that.
It's kind of the album cover for the Park Place.
I think that was actually one of the only pictures that was a formal picture.
Yeah, who took it? Do you remember?
Was that in reaction to because of all the group shots, like the Ferris Gallery? They were always, photographing them as a group, and all smoking or all wearing white pants, all lined up and leaning against each other or something. They were really hyper-posed. But you know what I'm talking about, the Ferris Gallery?
Of course, yeah.
And so now that predated. I mean, that was 59, 60, 61. But was that a reaction to things like that, or did you guys even know anything about the Ferris Gallery?
Did you pay attention to Southern California?
Not particularly. I didn't. I mean, others may have.
Because some of them end up coming here, like Larry Bell, and stuff, and having studios and working here in New York.
Yeah.
Even though they had started out in Los Angeles, but.
Wallace Berman might have been the link, because I think he was in Southern California, then the Bay Area, but I'm not sure.
Okay, maybe we should ask if there is any questions. And I would like to thank you for being here and
Thank you.
this development about the work. I think it should be continued, but I would like to invite guests if they have any questions. Please feel free. So.
There was a moment that Melissa was alluding to, maybe I asked you to comment on. Kubler talks about primary objects, modernism as originality, and you were speaking at one moment, and then you it moved into like kind of the identity of abstraction. You were talking about in spite of the arc of history, and you mentioned David Sally or Julian Schnabel, and you continued to work within this narrow set of concerns. And there's different artists that have done that and had different results, or not done it, like, say, Anquara's work is totally different because he stayed working within a narrow set of confines. Whereas mentioned, someone like Joe Baer completely shifted away from this hard edge geometric painting to, totally, the newer work was totally different. So as a painter, as an art historian, as a gallerist, what are your comments, not just on Leo's work, but other artists that continue to work within a narrow set of constraints in spite of movements of art history away from it?
Well, I think that more needs to be done with Leo's work because the scale in the 80s is totally different from the scale of his earlier work. From the shapes are different. So it really needs to be studied. So I don't have an answer about that. So I don't know that I would say that I would say that the through line is color and color harmonies, right? But I don't like what I guess what I'm trying to push back on is to say that just by looking at it like without really looking more at him and this kind of social history surrounding him, that we maybe don't have the whole story. And I don't think that work on Leo Valledor has been done, but I think it could and should be done. So that's all I'm saying about Valledor. And especially because those works are from the 1980s, and the 1980s are not the 1960s, which I think anybody would agree.
Well, I do think, your sort of broader question is also very interesting because it goes back to something we were talking about earlier in the panel of this idea of, how do artists develop? Because, often we look at the beginnings of artists' careers and we often see those as high points because often there's this moment in which artists enter history and, they're engaged in perhaps the most heightened way of their careers with, what's going on around them. And, they're often at that moment sort of maybe involved in shifting or moving what we see as the course of art history. And then we sort of wonder, 20 years later, what do they make? I always think about, I'm not an artist myself, but I always think, how do artists keep going, except that they feel, I think all artists feel that sort of need to make, and so then how do you manifest it? So then you have a range of artists. You have someone like Dan Flavin who said, in 3 years I had already arrived at my entire vocabulary, and then the rest of my life was to be spent, sort of basically producing all the variations, which could be endless. And then, Anquara that you mentioned is another artist who would fall into that sort of category. Then an artist like Joe Baer, I guess, is a good example of maybe the opposite pole of the spectrum, which is an artist who, really wore out, at least in her mind, a certain way of working and felt the need to make a radical shift. Though, of course, what's interesting is that from her perspective, it's not a radical shift.
Well, so this is what I would...
that's,
Like I met, Lucas Samaras is this artist I met,
Sure.
and he, in his home, has this drawing, right, from high school. And he said, Melissa, look at this drawing from high school and study it. And I did, and then we talked about it, and he said, it's the map of everything I'm going to make in my life. And he knew what he was going to do when he was 15 years old. All the clues are there. So like you can say, well, the Polaroids and the boxes, I don't really know. But to him, it's all of a piece. And And I think that when the artists break through, and it's, as Duchamp said, it's the critic's job to identify that, and they get to say it. An artist could say, "I broke through," and so what? You say that every time. So you think of Rauschenberg and his combines, right? But you don't think maybe of some of the earlier stuff, and maybe you don't think of the stuff from the 80s either, although we just had that marvelous show.
Or Soloit, who changed. He wrote one thing that they said, no, I don't actually, I not agree what I wrote, now I'm changing again.
Yeah, but the thing is that the thing that you're looking for might not be inconsistent once you really study that person in depth. So the thing that seems like, like this radical break, like the thing with even Malevich, if we read his writing, we shouldn't have been surprised by these weird fat people, that he started painting towards, it's obviously, it's in there, it's in his ideas, but, it's just, we prefer X to whatever. But then you wait 50 years and people are receptive to the thing that maybe, maybe 50 years from now when people talk about Joubert, they're not even going to talk about the white paintings. They'll be like really into this more Baroque, kind of work. You just don't know.
In a way, I think that's already happening with her. And I feel like in our conversation about Valledor, maybe towards the end of this conversation, I'm now thinking there's much more continuity than I imagined. Even though we're articulating these distinctions decade by decade, I think that we've really been able to isolate how color and form, they are constants. They the energy is there, even if the 80s work, is very different in some ways from the 60s work, and I think that's what you find often with artists is that oftentimes the more different it looks, when you really zoom in, you see more of the continuity. And I think you could say that about Joubert too, and this is what always interested me, for example, about Frank Stella. Like, why is he not want to talk about his early work? Is because he sees everyone loves the early work, but for him, he sees that as a primitive version of what he's doing today. Everything leads on, even if, of course, to most people, recent Frank Stella looks nothing like early Frank Stella. And yet, I think often artists, whether it seems again radically different or exactly the same, often artists are following a sort of line of thinking.
It's the same spirit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No matter what the form, and you can't get away from that. It's just kind of how it is.
Well, because your work has changed quite a bit from my limited understanding. You're in a very different place stylistically, but maybe not.
Many different things, and the more I look at what I've done, these various things, I can see how they relate.
Yeah.
And
another person may not.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's a kind of mysterious stuff. Like a seed knows that the oak tree is going to show up one day. It's like that. It's a kind of Jean Houston, she has.
Yeah.
She spoke of this word entelechy, which is kind of the germ of what materializes.
The Steiner.
The Steiner.
Steiner thing too.
Oh yeah.
It's a word. It's not. She's not the only user of it.
No, in the concept.
Okay, leave it for the end.
Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Can I just make a comment? I think it's great that you really opened up this whole subject of color in a way that I never would have thought of before. That's very provocative of you, Melissa.
Sorry.
No, I really like it, and I want to throw a question back at all of you. And that is that we are, in my mind, my limited scope, experiencing what I believe to be a resurgence of color in art. And I look at the Home show that's going to be at Broome. I was totally taken by the Swain show at your gallery. I am seeing this all over in very important ways and seeing color for color's sake. Not color, you know, it's really about color and sensation and all this. So I'm provoked and I throw the whole question at all of you, and you don't have to answer me at all, but wow, you know, we're at a moment here, a beginning of a moment anyway.
Interesting.
I mean, I feel like I could personally say a lot to that. I mean, just because that's a lot of what I think about too, is that. And I mean, I just think, you know, there are a lot of reasons, of course, for why color and abstraction is something that feels of our moment. And I think a lot of it has to do with, you know, the sort of, you know, the broader sort of culture and context. And I think actually what I've found is that, you know, if technology is a dominant aspect of our moment, I think that as much as technology is distancing, it's actually equally making people want to reconnect to sensation and experience. And this is a very, you know, quick thing to say, but, you know, I think actually that's a lot of what it is that, you know, and that I think actually for me is one reason why the 60s is so interesting, and one reason why we are looking, for example, at this sort of work now, which maybe was out of favor for a while, but why it seems so contemporary, is again that idea of color also in the context of technology. So if you think of the 60s as a moment of color television and 3D effects in movies and, you know, the space age, like all these ideas of... Absolutely, absolutely.
Psychedelia, fluorescent paint.
So all of those have their parallels today, and so we're...
Something else that I found immensely depressing, so I don't want to depress any of you, but
I'm already depressed.
Yeah, okay. Don't say that. But you know, you referred to something that Johnson did in terms of the color. Can you just say what it
Well,
was?
Johnson, I mean, of course, you know, when I'm not thinking about art, I'm just reading about the Trump administration and waiting for when it all implodes. But basically, what I was thinking about, you know, I think you're probably aware of the DACA, and they're trying to put more limits on immigration, and it's the same old stuff. I mean, America has done this, and when I think when I was reading about Leo Valledor and Carlos Villa, you know, they were kids, you know, but their parents' generation, you know, suffered so much from these racist immigration policies, and it's, you know, and they grew up with that, and they grew up in a country that was not welcoming. On the one hand, they had missionaries going to the Philippines and agents from the California and Hawaii from the agriculture businesses going there to recruit and get people to come, and then, you know, and then these acts started happening because, oh my God, say we have, you know, too many people who are not white, you know, populating our country. And so, I mean, it's the same thing that's going on right now. So during the Johnson administration, the Great Society, after Kennedy was killed, a lot of those ideas, you know, Kennedy was the New Frontier, Johnson was the Great Society. Those laws, you know, the Master of the Senate, he put those laws into place, and these are the laws right now that are currently
under scrutiny
and maybe being undone. And so it just, you know, it's just another reason to kind of look back at that moment and look at the conditions that people endured, and seemingly we're going to be, you know, unless we make a big change. So yes, I'm down in the dumps. Yeah. But I would say about Klimt's, Hilda Alt Klimt, her work is all part of some kind of religious practice.
Well, it's a spiritualist.
Yeah, and she didn't want anybody to see. Like, so this is, you know, so there's something going on. Those colors are not arbitrary. It's not color for color's sake. You know, it's supposedly
channels were dictated.
Right.
And nobody could really see them. You know, only the initiated, and they were too dangerous. But they're fabulous. Yes. So.
Yeah, about to be really revealed.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Me too.
That'll make me feel good. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you
What's
for
your
coming.
name? What's your name? Your
You
name.
know me.
Are you Kathleen? Catherine?
Do you think so?
Oh my God! Oh, we have to talk. Okay, actually, you have to meet Mary because you guys design. All right, wait, I got it. All right, yes, okay. I'm gonna put you. All right.
Well, thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you
for
so much.
Moderating.